With well-being and mental health coming to the forefront of our thinking now more than ever as a result of the challenges created by the COVID-19 pandemic, it's worth discussing the well-being of a group of our most important leaders, our school principals. Ticker Ed starts right now.
Ticker Ed, in association with Enquiry Tracker, empowering schools to manage and grow inquiries and online enrolments.
Hello and welcome back to Ticker Ed, where we will be unpacking and examining the way we teach, listen and learn from primary school education right through to university and beyond as well. And whilst Enquiry Tracker is the presenting sponsor of today's segment, all of the views and opinions in the following segment are of course our own. And joining me now is my regular co-host and co-founder of Enquiry Tracker, Greg Campitelli, with today's topic, and something that doesn't get a lot of attention, Greg, is principal well-being.
And how important is it, Mike?
Well,
you got to make your leaders right, don't you?
Well, when I read across our notes before the program, I did think, I've given that zero thought growing up, and especially when I was a student, we were inconsiderate.
We were. There's a really amazing project called the Australian Principal Health and Wellbeing Project, which started way back in 2011 and has had over 6,000 participants. In fact, it's one of the longest global studies of its kind in the world.
Wow.
And it's pretty amazing. There's some terrific findings.
It's very cool. So I guess we got to acknowledge, and is it the lack of attention this group, perhaps because we have this image of our school principals as these leaders, these people immune to the challenges of day-to-day life? They're always looking pretty dressed up and they deliver and they punctuate their days with work.
They do. So let's start with the positives. So the report finds that principals, and I'll read here, report high levels of meaning of their work.
Yep.
They have a strong commitment to their workplace and their self-efficacy. They're increasing their engagement with parents and caregivers, and that they are actively seeking support from other colleagues as a sustaining strategy. But what is clear, Mike, and as a result of what's been brought to bear across the whole education system globally, is the last 2 years of the COVID, which has brought devastation across the whole education system. Now, in Australia, throw in drought, fire and flood, and you're now dealing with catastrophic situations. In the Ukraine, it's war and devastation. But in times of crisis, it's the people at the top that we turn to for that leadership, of course. At Enquiry Tracker, we know that the frontline staff are really critical, but as they say, the buck stops with the principal. They're the leader at the top.
It's generally the people you turn to and everybody looks at, especially when there's things to be blamed for, etc. It's that sort of scary spot. But let's acknowledge the frontline staff for a minute, the teachers, the reception, everyone involved in these institutions. But invariably, as you said, that buck's stopping there with the principal and it's taking its toll. So let's unpack that a bit more, because that's just the nub of it, what you've presented.
And there's a long list. And to be truthful, many of these stress factors have been around for a long period of time. It just seems that they're more exacerbated now.
All right,
let's start with number one. They're taking the job of a CEO without perhaps the historical experience. You and I have spoken about that they're managing large organisations with big budgets and a big staff, a lot of responsibility.
Absolutely.
There's this rising issue of student and teacher mental health and mental wellbeing. These rates are rapidly rising. We've spoken about that on the program previously. There's safety within the classroom. There's the rise of the adversarial parent who treats themselves as the customer.
Yes.
They've often got to report to authorities with their departments of education, boards or councils. And there's this time management split in their work life. Principals on average are working up to 59 hours a week, and probably the last piece of the mental health wellbeing puzzle is their own.
Of course, as humans should have.
Probably a great time to bring in our guest.
Let's welcome Dr. Paul Kidson, the Senior Lecturer for Educational Leadership and Head of Postgraduate Education at the Australian Catholic University. Welcome.
Mike, Greg, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk with you about how we can support some of these most significant of our community leaders after what's been a fairly traumatic and trying time, and as we see currently will continue for some time yet, I imagine.
100%, we're still feeling the effects. But let's talk a little bit about your extraordinary project and the key findings of your most recent report. Can you unpack that for us?
Yes, I certainly can. And I should say that I was a principal for over a decade and I contributed to the report as a principal. And in those early years, I think we were all very excited to kind of get some insights about how we could be sustaining ourselves, and that is the driver of the project. Over these last few years, and Greg indicated this in his own intro, there's been not only COVID, but a number of communities that have had fire, flood in various parts of Australia at the moment. They're going through repeat significant weather events. Now, we expected under those circumstances that a number of principals would probably say, oh, I just am running out of energy. I'm just running out of steam. To the contrary, we found that their commitment to the work, the value that they place on the work, their satisfaction and their engagement with their communities stabilised and in some instances increased. It would have been reasonable under the circumstances that they wanted to pull up a little bit short, but instead they're doubling down on their commitment and their contribution to leading their communities through these challenging times.
Indeed. Well said, Paul. So what are some of the main issues you see facing principals now?
Unfortunately, some of the challenges that contribute to those stresses are not being resolved. And in 19 stresses that they report, the highest one is bureaucratic administrative work that doesn't necessarily lead to improved or helping student learning outcomes. Now, COVID will pass. These challenges will pass. Those things need to be redressed at a whole of system level. They haven't gone away, and whilst they've been able to sustain their work through that, as well as COVID, we must now turn our attention to starting to resolve those. The highest change of the rate, because we asked them to rate those stresses, has been teacher shortages. And we're seeing that again writ large at the moment around the nation and indeed around the globe. There are some nations who their principals are under extraordinary duress because of the inability to be able to get staff just to be able to keep students engaged. Some schools that are collapsing classes into 50 students who in some respect are not much more than being supervised. That is not a long-term sustainable position, and yet that continues to be a challenge that we need to look at the whole of system. It's not just a small section, it's broad-based.
Absolutely, and you can only imagine the damage this is having ongoing for the disruption for the children's education. Of course, somebody think of the children, right? Yeah. But is this a global trend? Is this a universal across all countries when it comes to principals trying to manage these ongoing challenges?
Well, indeed, in the same way that COVID has its own kind of particularity amongst different nations, it's going to be the case for those principles as well. What we do know internationally, though, is there's been a significant increase, and I'll use one example, if I can, Mike, of standardised testing and a continued press for an economic imperative around education. Education fundamentally is a social, relational and emotional pursuit. And yes, we do want children to be able to grow into young people who are adequately prepared to go out into the workforce. But fundamentally, we want them to be good, civic, community-minded people. And that focus is often being distracted by some of the administrative and bureaucratic processes that are geared towards large scale. In Australia, if we talk about NAPLAN, but globally, we could talk about PISA, we could talk about, back in the United States, the No Children Left Behind and the residual that has. When we start to prioritise these very narrow windows of what represents learning and schooling, we start to get additional stresses and pressures that are only contributing, actually, ironically, to under and declining achievement.
So, Paul, in a word, what are some of the tips and tricks that principals can use to improve their own mental well-being and look after themselves so they stay good, strong leaders and stay in the system and not leave?
I wouldn't like to reduce it just to one or two because it is a complex issue. The first one is that nobody is going to take care of yourself other than you. Systems can do some things, communities can do some things, but in the end, there is a personal responsibility that principals are going to need to enact. Now, that's hard when there's a lot of pressure and stress put on you, a lot of expectation put on you. Mike, you were saying in the intro, we often look towards principals as being this custodian of all the things that are right in the school. And schools are welcoming and they bring people in all the time. Sometimes principals need to ensure that they are not only caring for those entrusted to their care, but they're also giving themselves permission to care for themselves. That's diet, that's sleep, that's exercise, that's engaging with other people. It's being able to say at the end of the day, no, there must be a limit that I have to set. There's always going to be more work that they can do, but they need to be able to involve themselves in caring for themselves.
Dr. Kidson, just to wrap up the program, what advice would you have for principals that should maybe connect with parent committees, staff, boards, departments? What should they be doing in order to help, just to wrap up the program?
I think a real major challenge here is that those systems, departments, boards, parent groups give principals permission to look after themselves. Say, take care, invest in yourself so that you are well and you can care for us.
What a wonderful way to end the program. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk all things principals and wellbeing as well, Dr. Kidson.
Thanks very much for having me.
Wonderful. Greg, as always, let's leave us with some top tips for today.
Well, at Inquiry Tracker, we know we've got to look after people. And one of the things I would ask schools to adopt for the principals, adopt technology. Adopt technology to make sure you're using tech to save time and get greater efficiency, particularly around that bureaucratic point that Paul just raised. But there are 3 tips. Let's put them on the screen. Build a trusted leadership group, number 1. Number 2, be an active participant in professional development. And number 3, ensure you've got structured weekly downtime. Pilates, golf, Tai Chi. Look after yourself and you'll look after your team.
I do a little bit of Pilates.
Do you do a bit of Pilates?
I need to get back there though.
I used to do a bit of Tai Chi.
Well, there you go. Greg, thank you so much for joining me on the program. As always, Ticker Ed is bringing everything education to our audience, so thank you.
Cheers.
What a great show today, guys, presented by the team over at Inquiry Tracker. And if you'd like to learn more about how your school can utilise this amazing admissions software, do head to inquirytracker.net. I'm your host, Mike Loder, and I want to thank you for joining me on the program. I'll see you again soon. Be well.